Thanks, sir. Mr. Wright, thank you for being such a proud South Carolinian and representing us so well. A couple of questions for you. I think it's fascinating that we spend a little time on the $20 billion that we have in the flood insurance program and the debt that we have, taking the 1.5% interest rate to 5%, 1/3 of the overall revenues that come in go out for interest payments and servicing the debt. That means that fewer dollars actually solve the problem of flood insurance. And I thought what you were saying there and said, what if you were a country that had $31 trillion of debt? That same 1.5% goes to 5 or 6% interest. Multiply that by $31 trillion. You come up with the single largest line item in all of your expenditures. It's not your military, it's not your domestic programs, it's not the futures. It's literally servicing your debt, and maybe without actually reducing a single penny of your debt. So if we have a crisis at $20 billion in the flood insurance program, and we do, there's no way to forgive $16 billion or $16 trillion of our national debt. That has to be paid back. So you think about the actual weight of the out-of-control, reckless spending of my friends on the other side of the aisle, and you come to the conclusion that sooner or later, you got to pay the piper. And the challenge that we're facing as a nation is that we seem to be completely disconnected from reality, that somehow, some way, we can continue to have conversations around raising our debt ceiling without actually reducing our spending ever. That seems to be someplace that I haven't been, an alternate universe that doesn't exist. And if we're this concerned, I'm glad to hear that we're serious about figuring out how to deal with the $20 billion of debt that we have in the National Flood Insurance Program. That is a crisis for the program. $31 trillion is a crisis for the American people, with $98,000 on average being owed by every single American. So thinking about what we're trying to figure out here, more than 2 years after passage of the ARPA, Democrats' reckless spending still has $150 billion sitting on balance sheets around the country. Of the funds that have been spent, there are far too many examples of waste, trying to figure out how to meet the obligations without wasting money. Billions of federal dollars spent on golf course irrigation, bids to host the World Cup, and other activities that are almost certainly not addressing the needs of vulnerable people. Additionally, programs specifically designed to mitigate flood saw substantial funding increases. FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, BRIC, or the FMA, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, or the STORM, as you know, all the acronyms, the alphabet soup here, and numerous other programs at the Army Corps of Engineers and other agencies saw billions of new funding. My simple point is that sometimes excessive spending on programs doesn't always solve the problem. That leads to my question. Is now the time for more spending, and is now the time that we should ensure all this funding is spent in smart, targeted ways to mitigate risk?
Thanks, Senator. I think where we currently sit today, the allocations that have been made are sufficient to address the near-term pieces of this risk. The biggest challenge, and you've highlighted this, is getting the money to the rural and non-urban context. The money is available. Now let's go back through and spend it well.
How do we do it? Can you give me some examples?
So
one of the challenges that we have, of course, is you look at the areas that are, I use air quotes to say, prone to flooding, like Charleston, where I grew up. But you see so many of the challenges and the incidents in areas that have zero flood insurance. We had the other witness talk about the 90% of flooding will be paid for by the NFIP and not by private insurance. Well, the mapping that we're talking about, not only we're looking at the next iteration of the mapping, we need to rethink the definition of mapping to include the interior of this nation that continues to have flooding, and we haven't done that. So expanding flood insurance, I think, is a good idea, but how do we get to the question on the table?
Yeah, I think, Mr. Scott, I think, as I mentioned, that community disaster resilience zones legislation that Congress passed last year is really pivotal. It says go identify 100 places across the country where the need is great and the natural natural perils are going to collide, and make sure that they get the help they need and they get the priority that they need. I think that's a place where the funding and the authorities that Congress has already put in place need to be used by FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program so that, yes, we're helping Charleston, but we're also helping Georgetown, and we're helping Columbus, Ohio, and we're addressing the needs in Montgomery, Alabama. All of those need to be addressed, and I think the tools are there if the agency will choose to act.
Thank you, sir.